Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're going to start the last official panel before some wrap-up. I do want to tell you that this session has actually a somewhat different format, and I'll be perfectly transparent. Professor Dr. Hauser, who is an expert on working codes, could not come because he was ill at the last moment. So, I first have the distinct honor of introducing Richard Morgan, who is the Director of Energy Management and Sustainability for Austin Energy. And for those of you who don't know, Austin Energy is a publicly owned utility here in Austin. And then I'm going to give, so Richard's going to talk about Austin Energy and the initiatives that have done. And then I'm going to follow up with some, I think, very general comments about the problem of regulation and what that entails, actually for both cultures, with the hope of then stimulating a conversation. If I can start a fight, I'll be very pleased about that, because we'll have a panel of our distinguished German visitors to be able to respond to what both Richard and I have to say. And we'll simply ask them to do a very short response of 2 or 3 minutes, and then we can open it up for a conversation. Any questions about the format? Terrific. Richard?
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here as someone who works kind of on the edge of regulation and developing new standards. A lot of what I hear is what can't be done. Today I've heard a lot about what can be done. And that's a real pleasure for me. It's a really cool event. I'm going to talk about today, and I'm not going to use a PowerPoint. I'm going to talk today about the process that we use specifically to develop our energy codes and how we use our internal city resources and the people who are building and work with us on the outside, the architects and the engineers and the contractors and the developers, to put us in the position that we are of having a strong green building program, but also a very strong, recognized nationally and maybe a little bit internationally, as having a very strong energy code, very progressive energy code, and maintaining that status year after year, code cycle after code cycle. And to do that, I think one of the things I have to do is give you a little bit of background. Both Lucia and yesterday, and Michael Garrison this morning, said that green building started here in 1990. It was the first green building initiative in the United States, and that's true. But that green building initiative evolved from another program called Austin Energy Star Homes, which was an alternative path to energy code compliance that the city put together in 1985 when we adopted our first energy code. So rather than just having a building inspector come out to the building site, and what we do in Austin is either the building inspector signs the tag or he sticks a big red tag with all of your deficiencies listed on it on your site. What staff from the Austin Energy Star Homes program did was to work with designers and builders and help them find the best, most cost-effective way, not just to meet the energy code, but to exceed it. So we had our roots, green building had its roots in the energy code. And now in the 90s, we've focused on green building, developing that first single family rating and then later a commercial rating. And then as we went on, we developed a multifamily rating. And somewhere in there, we got back involved in the energy code business. And that's what I want to generally to talk to you about today. But I think there's more background than that I need to talk about why this process was, why we were able to put a process like this in place in Austin. And you've heard a couple of times over the last 2 days that Austin Austin was recognized by the American Council on an energy efficient economy as the sixth most energy efficient city in the United States. That's true, we're very proud of that. Environment Texas just recognized us as the leading city within Texas for renewable energy, clean energy, energy efficiency. That's not surprising for those of you who are from Texas. And the rankings, we were ranked very high in building energy efficiency and a number of other things. But there were a lot of items that we didn't rank so high on. And one of those was the percentage of utility revenue spent on energy efficiency programs. Now, the first ranked city was Boston with their utility N-Star, and they spend 4.26% of utility revenues on energy efficiency programs. Second ranked city was Seattle and Seattle City Light, and they spent 4.18% of utility revenues on energy efficiency programs. Austin was ranked 23rd, spending 1.28% of utility revenue on energy efficiency programs. So we all know, we've all heard many times in discussions about how to improve energy efficiency, that the best way to do that is to add more money, more staff, more incentives, all of that. So how do we get to this position where we can be the sixth most energy efficient city in the country when our city-owned utility is ranked 23rd in the country for large cities in utility spending on energy efficiency programs? I think it's largely cultural. I mean, it's not due so much to us as the way this city is organized, who lives here, the political interactions that have happened over the last 40 years. And I'll talk about those a little bit right now. Austin was considered weird by the rest of Texas long before we adopted a marketing slogan that says, "Keep Austin weird." That was, I thought that was a great slogan until the first time I saw it stuck on the back of a Cadillac Escalade SUV. And then I decided I would rather have Leslie as our icon for weirdness. I guess the people from Germany don't know who Leslie is. Leslie was a gentleman with long hair and a beard, and he used to stand on the corner of 6th and Congress in a padded brassiere and thong and high-heel shoes at noontime and waved to everybody. Some people thought Leslie went too far. Other people thought Leslie was an icon, and that's part of what makes Austin weird. So is it a marketing slogan? Is it the way we actually live in Austin? There are a lot of reasons for all of that. Some of that relates to the music culture. You all know, what a fantastic music culture we have here. Some of it, a large part of it, probably the most important cultural influence, over two cultural influences over the last 40 years, have been the purchase of 16% of the South Texas nuclear project by the Austin Electric Utility Department, the city of Austin, which is now Austin Energy, back in the 1980s. And in the late 70s, City Council held a referendum, and the citizens decided that we would invest about $160 million in 16% of the South Texas nuclear project. Over the next 7 or 8 years, there were 6 more referenda held, 6 times. This issue went to the voters. And among those referendums, we approved more money to pay our share of it, to pay for that 16%. The citizens refused to sell our share in the South Texas project. The citizens approved a referendum to sell our share in the South Texas project. And unfortunately, there were no buyers for it after we approved that. And the other part of that, after these 6 referendums, was that it seemed that during that period of time, no city council member could stay on council for more than one session or one term, because every time the citizens changed their mood or we got more bad news about STP, that council would get voted out, and we would change our mood, and we would decide we didn't want anything to do with it, and we would come back. So that went on for 8 or 9 years. Finally, STP was completed, about 600% over budget and 8 years late. We still own it because we couldn't sell it after we tried to. And now it's producing about a third of our energy at a reasonable cost. We're still paying the debt, and is producing very few CO2 emissions. So maybe it's a good thing. But we do have to look back at those political battles that went on 10 to 12 years and was really contested. And at the same time, we had another political conflict going on between the environmental community in Austin that was very, very concerned about the development that was taking place in Austin, particularly in southwest Austin, over the Bartlett Springs recharge zone, which is where a lot of our drinking water comes from. And it was loosely regulated development. I won't say it was unregulated, but it was very loosely regulated. And the environmental community really wanted a moratorium on any development on these environmentally sensitive lands, not just southwest, but in other places. On the other hand, we had a development community that was trying to meet the needs of the city that, as a couple of people have said so far, I think Fritz said yesterday, that Austin, since the turn of the last century, has doubled its population every 20 years. There's an incredible need for new buildings, for new land. And unfortunately, the development community came to be associated with one particular CEO who, in an all-night city council meeting, threatened to sue the city into bankruptcy if he didn't get his projects approved. He didn't get his projects approved, and we're still here. But it was an ongoing battle that, to a larger or lesser extent, continues today. We have the same issues. We don't argue too much about STP anymore. Our arguments are more about how much money we should be spending on solar, how much we should be spending on different types of energy efficiency. Our arguments over the land development are very much the same, but they've lost the intensity, much of the intensity that we had in the past, because both groups represented in these conflicts have come to realize that the pendulum is never going to swing completely one way or the other. Neither one is ever going to be able to put the whole ball of wax in their pocket and walk away and say, we've got it. Because the citizens of Austin will always largely sided with the environmental community. And then the state legislature, if we go too far, has always dialed us back. There's actually a term we use for that type of legislation. It's called Austin bashing. Seldom used against any other city. So we have this, it's not a stalemate. We don't have the government shut down like they do in Washington. But we've come to recognize that when people of goodwill will come together and seek to identify common cause, common needs, and common solutions that work for both sides, that we can move forward and create a more sustainable future for the city of Austin, where neither side is going to be completely happy. And I won't say that it's perhaps the best for the city, but at least we've managed to keep the city and our environment afloat for the last 50 years. Whether we'll be able to do that another 50 years or not, we don't know. But so far we've been successful in balancing those needs. I believe we've been successful. People will argue that, and that's part of why Austin is the way it is. As a result of that, as part of this understanding, mutual understanding, that people can come together and work out their differences, we've been able to do some really incredible things. And I told you that Austin Energy Green Building started as a code project and has now gotten much more involved in codes again. We're actually responsible for working with the city's planning and development review department to ensure that the codes, that we have the highest level of code compliance that we can reasonably obtain. And we're also, Austin Energy Green Building is also responsible for developing new codes and bringing them forward for adoption. In the United States, we have model codes that are developed by the International Energy Conservation, by the International Code Council, under the auspices of DOE, but the federal government doesn't have the authority to tell any state to adopt this code or to adopt that code. So each state chooses their own energy code, and we only have one or two that don't have any energy code at all anymore. There used to be a lot of them. And in Texas, we have since 2001, we do have a statewide building code. It's relatively progressive. It is not what we would want to see in Austin. I think we're still under the 2009, we're still waiting for parts of the 2009 ICE International Energy Conservation Code to be adopted. But, as somebody referred to yesterday, we're a home rule city. In Texas, we have home rule cities, which means that we can do a lot of things that nobody else could even imagine could be done. So we take the code and we amend it. We make it suit our needs. And so in 2006, my boss, Roger Duncan, and I were walking down the hall one day, and I said, I want us to really take an aggressive stance on code adoption this year. And Roger looked at me and he said, how aggressive? And I said, I want to require testing on everything. And Roger said, no, I want every home to be zero energy. I want every home to be zero energy by picking it. And so, working with council, Roger got council to prepare a resolution that said that a task force would be put together, and we would create a plan to make every home in Austin zero energy capable by 2015. There's no further definition or anything, just zero energy capable by 2015. And that's a good thing, because that gave us the opportunity to do what we needed to do. So we brought together a group of architects, engineers, builders, affordable housing advocates, energy efficiency advocates, housing finance professionals, and we met for 9 months and worked through a lot of different issues. But when we came out the other side, we had consensus. We had unanimous approval for a plan that we took to council. Council adopted. That gave us incremental steps of energy efficiency for the 2006 code, which we hadn't adopted yet. We didn't adopt it until 2008. The 2009, 2012, 2015. The 2012 code just went into effect on the 16th of September. So we're moving along that path. But the goal to make all homes zero energy capable homes, when it says all homes, it has to be code. So the goal was to get this group of people to agree on the strategies that would get us to that goal. And the first things that we identified that had to be done in 2006, or the code that we adopted in 2008, and these don't laugh, because these are the basic building blocks of energy efficiency in a home. We already had a reasonable standard for insulation. And so this group of builders, air conditioning contractors, people who were involved in the industry every day, made their living at it, were able to agree that we would require documentation for HVAC design to be submitted as part of the permit package, that the HVAC system in the envelope would be tested to verify compliance with ACA standards, the American Council, Air Conditioning Contractors Association of America standards, that a minimum of 50% of the lighting would be high efficacy. As you heard this morning, that's now 90%. And that we would enhance the level of HVAC duct system insulation. Now these, like I said, these are the basic building blocks of energy efficiency after you have a decent envelope. But for the 30 years that we've had energy codes in the United States, only a small handful of jurisdictions, including California, had been able to come to terms with HVAC testing, envelope testing, and require that of all homes. And when we started talking to this about people around the country, everybody was shocked. How did you get there? How did the builders agree to this? Well, the builders agreed to this because 3 years prior to this, we had said that within green building, no home should be rated as a green built home unless it had all this testing done. So we started off requiring testing for 5-star homes for 1 year, testing for, that's our highest rating, testing for 3 and 4-star homes for a year, and then we started requiring testing for all homes. So by the time that we had this task force convened, all the builders, knew other builders, either had tested homes themselves, knew other builders who had tested homes. They could talk to their HVAC contractors and know that this was something that they could do. They also learned that this would get them fewer callbacks. It would get them systems that were actually sized properly for the house that they were building, and not just sized to cover up the deficiency in the installation that was happening because nobody was testing it. And we also had a professional infrastructure of people doing this testing. So what's the problem? There's very little discussion about it. We were able, because of this collaborative work that we had done in the years leading up to that, we were able to work with the builders, get them to go against everything that they had been taught over the last 25 or 30 years and agree this kind of aggressive code adoption. And over the years, we've done very much the same thing with reflective roofing, with mechanical system commissioning, and we're talking about commercial buildings, the commercial code as well as the residential code right now. And always, it's by working with the most progressive of the building industry, the architects and the engineers, the contractors, who are out there working on green building projects, and working with them to help them to understand what products actually work, what product systems and strategies actually work, that they're cost effective, and to help them understand that there's actually a supply chain that exists for these materials and systems, and that there's a professional infrastructure to install that knows how to install it. That I think is the key to how we got from 23rd on utility energy efficiency expenditures as a percent of utility revenue to 6th in the most energy efficient city in the country, in the United States. That's quite an achievement. And so our philosophy has always been that we have to seek out these collaborative opportunities and not always put ourselves in conflict with the trade associations. We can't avoid it sometimes. Sometimes we just can't avoid it. Sometimes we have to sit down and have the hard discussions and say, you know, we're not going to give on this one. We're going to have to find some other way to solve this solution, to solve this problem, because this is critical to what we're doing. But we try to limit those, and we found that that's reciprocated by the builders. So I think that is the lesson, the primary lesson I wanted to I want to give about energy codes in the city of Boston and how they work. Now, over the course of today, I've heard a number of things that led me to think about some of the things that we're planning for the future. Now, we've talked a lot about prescriptive codes today. And frankly, I think prescriptive codes have lived past their usefulness. We'll always need some forms of prescriptive codes for remodels and retrofits, and maybe for smaller buildings, but we need to move to a performance-based code. And not just modeling the energy efficiency, but a performance-based code where we can calculate water use. And where when we're talking about energy efficiency, we're talking about a real standard, not just that we've achieved an improvement on energy efficiency on a building that is designed with similar systems and products. I think where we need to go with this is to have some kind of hard metric, kilowatt hours per square foot, whatever it is. But we need to have that hard metric, and we need to give the designers, the architects, the engineers, and the contractors the opportunity, and the building product suppliers, the opportunity to tell us how they're going to achieve that goal. And get rid of the 20 pages of tables for the different levels of efficiency that you have to achieve if you have a steel frame building or if you have a masonry building. Why should a masonry building be less efficient than a steel frame building? That makes no sense. We need to focus on the use or the occupancy of the building and say that an office building should achieve this level of energy efficiency. And we don't care how you get there, but just get there. And that ultimately will lead us not just to a code to model the energy use, but it'll lead us to a code where we're monitoring energy use and reporting 2 years after the certificate of occupancy is issued, did this building actually achieve the code? Now, when I talk about that, even with the people I work most closely with, they generally laugh at me. But think about it. That's where we need to be. One of the things that we've talked a lot about today is existing buildings. And it's true that the improvements that we've made in the codes in the United States, and I think to a lesser extent in Europe, have made improvements to existing buildings, but they certainly haven't gotten the existing buildings to where we need them to be. And one of the processes that we've started here is our energy audit and conservation and disclosure ordinance. And that requires that all homes over 10 years old have to have an energy audit done before they can be sold. And the results of that energy audit have to be disclosed to the potential buyer. We do the same thing slightly differently with multifamily and commercial buildings. In commercial buildings, the results of the audit have to be disclosed to tenants. We haven't reached the stage yet where we're requiring retrofits based on those audits, except in the case of multifamily buildings or multifamily properties that use more than 150% of the average energy used for similar properties. In those cases, we have begun to require some retrofits to get them back down at least to that 150% more than the average property is using. And I think we can take that another step further. These are long-term goals, but I think they're things that we can always, that we're going to have to deal with. And these are the things that are going to make the difference in how we develop codes and how we develop this industry over the next 20 or 30 years to meet the goals that we have to meet to keep our planet alive, to make sure that my daughter's children have the opportunities that we have. So those are my thoughts on the code from Boston, and I appreciate your time.
do. Roger's comments or Richard's comments have really made it possible for me to become more abstract and kind of zoom out a little bit. But so even before I do that, I should explain who I am. So I'm Stephen Moore. I'm the Bartlett Cocke Regents Professor of Architecture and Planning and the Director of the Graduate Program in Sustainable Design. My training is that I'm an architect, a planner, and a social scientist. So I wear multiple hats. So I want to do a little logic game here and actually lead us through, I think, a social structural condition where I think Austin is at the moment. And I would be very interested to hear the response of our German colleagues. So assumption number one is that building cultures of Munich and Austin are really very different. And we've used that term actually quite a few times today, but no one has yet defined it. So I have a compelling need to define the term building culture, and so I'm going to take that from a book by Howard Davis called Cultures of Building, which in my view is the book on the topic. So the culture of building is the coordinated system of knowledge, rules, procedures, and habits that surround the building process in any given place or time. If we were to do even any kind of index of the buildings that, the historic and current buildings that are Munich and Austin, we realize that these are very, very different building cultures. So we begin with the difference. Assumption number two is that in spite of that difference, we have a common problem. The common problem is that we have all been thrown into the same need to respond to the problems catalyzed by the threats intended to climate change. And so whether we express our problems in kilowatt hours per square meter per year or BTUs per square foot per year, it's still the same problem. So we're different, but we're the same. But there's a problem. So the problem is that if we simply talk and work towards increasing the efficiency of context-independent technologies, in other words, a packaged air conditioning unit or the equivalent, if we talk only about context-independent technological systems, we are only dealing with half of the problem. Right? In other words, all systems, all technological systems, are made up with the technological side, but also the social side. In other words, technological practices require not only things, but the knowledge to make and utilize those things and the social practices to make them operate. And if we're not thinking about the social practices or the knowledge required to operate them, we're operating in a partial vacuum. But we've had considerable success, right? The considerable success that many of our presenters today have really demonstrated, which is very encouraging. And we've become increasingly sensitive to the context-dependent environmental conditions. That's really terrific. We have new modeling tools, but we're learning how to use those. We're making them more effective and more accurate. But the second problem is that although we consider the variables of context-dependent environmental conditions, we continue to pretty much ignore the variables of context-dependent social practices. How do we inhabit our buildings? What are our practices? How do we design interfaces, usually called thermostats, that actually have something to do with real human practices and real human places? So we argue that design of social systems, many argue that the design of such social systems is just beyond what architects and engineers are trained to do. That's not our job. We can't do that. Or I have heard others argue that, well, you can't do that. That's illegal. That's social engineering. Architects and designers should not be involved in such behavioral practices. Well, I think both are incredibly defensive and simply go to what the real project is. If we're not engaged in the process of designing social practices, we're doing it anyway by default. So problem number 3 is the claim that all scientifically derived codes, standards, and regulations also hold within them social values, whether or not they are recognized by code makers. So, in other words, I'm saying we're making social policy inside the black box of technological change, whether we admit it or not. So I think it's time we fess up and take responsibility for what, in fact, we really are doing. So I have a couple of propositions. So proposition number 1 is that technological codes and standards are both an index of social values. In other words, those values that Richard so nicely narrated are really an index of how not only contractors and builders feel about social and technological change, but it's also the people they work for. Right? So they're an index of social values and a method also to enforce those social values. In other words, technological codes are also social codes. So proposition number 2. Standards and regulations should focus not only on context-independent physical phenomena expressed in energy per spatial unit per unit of time, but also context-dependent social phenomena expressed as measures of social practices and social equity. Now, we haven't talked about these variables at all today. But as a social scientist, what I am prepared to argue is that these things, in fact, are measurable. And the fact that we're not measuring them simply makes our designs not adequately rigorous. Now, that's a real challenge to an engineer, but I will throw that down on the table. Now, I'm going to say, for example, where do our technologies come from? Right? They often come from conflicts between battles for market share, and that's the way it works in a liberal democracy or a neoliberal democracy. But I'm also arguing that the technological change might also emerge from an analysis of our social needs as well as our technological wants. So that would be introducing the very idea of democratic values into the making of technological artifacts. So proposition 3 is that standard making is not a simple matter of managing energy flows, it's the design of a way of life. Now the image that's up here is the 1928 plan of the city of Boston. And that was a technological plan of infrastructure distribution, a technological map. What's hidden behind the map, right, is the idea that it forcibly relocated, the allocation of infrastructure forcibly relocated African and Latino Americans, Austinites, from the west side of Boston to the east side of Boston. Those are rather deep cultural values implemented by technological policy. And I'm not arguing that all technological policies are quite so overt as this case, right? But I'm saying that all technological policy has some social value within it. So this leads me to the last point, the research question. So how then might the lessons learned in both city regions influence the self-conscious construction of a way of life that absolutely minimizes energy consumption, but it also enhances well-being, which will be measured differently in each city? We can measure kilowatt per hours per square meter per year in both places, and those answers will be the same. But the definition of what it means for human well-being will be different. And until we start defining that half of the system, I think we're doing inadequate work. Thank you. And maybe the rest of our panelists would come up and chew on these narratives for a bit.
doesn't matter. Being maybe more meaningful, especially if you have the renewable energies driving the whole thing, so that you connect basically the single houses or multi-family houses to the system, and even take economic factors into account, so an overall view of whether it might make more sense to go in a kind of a distributed way, having kind of combined heat and power plant, or do the thermal simulation, the thermal insulation, what we're doing on a large scale right now, by code, by law, and it might be completely the wrong way to go, finding out that in 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we have to rip that stuff off because it just does not work. So it's an economic risk, it's a health risk, and it might not even do anything good with regard to the energy consumption of the building, because maybe in 10 or 20 years we would be worse off than now because we've wasted all the time, resources, energy, money we don't have to invest anymore because it's gone. You might be still paying back the mortgages, for doing all that stuff. And we cannot cover that by code making. We can only cover that somehow by knowledge and a wider view at the whole issue. I don't know whether general taxation will solve that, but I think we definitely have to broaden our mind into the options we might have instead of going for a single issue without code making. I think that's very restricted right now and even dangerous.
I agree. Having been look at code very, very different from kind of story. In other words, it's the practice of what you're doing, I think, is that making coherent public policy. But making structural change to public policy that's funded actually taxation. In the U.S., we simply don't have that funding, and especially at the economic level. So the way that Richard, over 20 years, has been able to create very, very significant, not only technological change, but environmental change, and now social change. This is a very kind of grassroots movement. It's incremental, and it's done through public-private partnerships and engaging directly with the trades, that we're small players in a culture of construction. So the process is really our work. And so in many ways, we're unbelievably dangerous. We need to do that. But of course, that might be said. There's no government will ever be able to do it.
Well, the reason we do what we do in the United States today is because of our political model. The reason we look at codes today, the reason we have our regulations and our standards for energy efficiency is because of the political law. And for the last 30 years, we've probably treading on dangerous ground here. For the last 30 years, we've lived in a very conservative political law. Trying to think back to a time when we had a similar issue that we did deal with something similar to a carbon tax, an issue where our solution was actually a governmental solution rather than what passes for a free market solution. In our country today. So I'm hopeful that we're, despite the things that are really causing things that are happening today, that we will be where the pendulum swings back and forth, and that we will be moving in the next 10 or 15 years to a place where a governmental solution, whether it's a carbon tax, whether it's some other system, might be possible. And I agree with Stephen that over the course of time I've been in Austin, over the course of most of my working career, these things have not been possible. But because I'm very concerned about this, I believe that we may have an opportunity thinking about what those solutions might look like. The carbon tax is simply raising the price of energy. And frankly, we get our energy away from Texas. But in Germany, I understand the average cost per kilowatt is pretty much like 20 cents. Not 30. Yeah. So, and that's, and you still have some of the same issues that we have today. So is it purely a taxation issue, or is it some combination of cost and regulation that will make this happen? I don't know what that is. But clearly the model that we're using here today in the United States today is treading water. Because we're a bit more progressive in Austin than a lot of places. And I will be the first to admit that most of what we're doing is treading water.
I think, of course, our culture is to deal with this kind of subjects and problems are quite different, as you mentioned, and thank you for your lecture, because you have mentioned in the end is social argument, which when you have to implement all these nice things we are doing to each other, play a very huge role. So I think Germans, of course, have a very different approach in believing in codes, standards, and criteria, and then carry them out sometimes also without regarding to the context. So I don't think taxes can be a solution. Obviously, they are not, but what they can sometimes is to make people wake up. So, I mean, if you have then a discussion about taxes, something, it really becomes an argument and also a social argument. So maybe sometimes the sense, in my opinion, could stay in that, not that we resolve really the problem with taxes. But anyway, I mean, I'm an architect now also that I don't planner, and I'm a little bit shocked about all these databases and codes and measurements and certifications and so on. I mean, it's right that we need a reflection in science we are doing. And for that it's very important what researchers and universities and so on are elaborating in this way. But on the other hand, I feel that it's quite like an obsession to have everything measured, and then you think you will find the truth, and you will not. And I'm really convinced that this effort to go always to the maximum is completely the wrong way, because maximum means not the quickest possible time ever. And that's why we are doing all these insulation things. I mean, what you said now, we know it's the wrong way. And I'm sure that we have to invent a program, a grant, for dismantling all the stuff in 10, 20 years. I mean, this we know all. So it's not, it's absolutely not necessary to build databases and things like that on this issue. And what we didn't address even now is the big picture. You said it as an answer to the question. The big role in Germany is different. The industry does. I mean, our minister is saying all these things because the lobby of the industry, the insulation industry, they have a big lobby, we know. And also the normal people which have to pay all these taxes and so on, and energy passes and energy, they don't have this problem.
making more progress with it. What you're teaching is to say, okay, number one, during building culture has a predisposition to like codes and norms and respond to them. Texas building culture has a predisposition to be skeptical of codes and see them as an imposition on individual freedom. But we still, given those basic cultural conditions, we still have something important to learn. Right? Because you're saying there is a danger because you have almost like launch to make technological arguments in the policy, but you don't want to overstep it because in fact that could cause great problems. You know, but for Richard, that might be what you're doing the whole time. You should actually do that because you can. But also, you might also benefit from some understanding technological change to skepticalize. And whether how do you not make futuristic, big changes in phenomena? It's more incremental approach rather than a large approach. So I think my hope is that we get these things out on the table, then we actually become more capable of learning from each other. But we have to recognize those differences are really significant and are really at the foundation of how we approach the work.
The difference is the same, but the problem is the same. The problem is, I come to where I am now from affordable housing background. I worked with young people who work in affordable housing. And I guess since that is so implicated in everything I'm thinking, that sometimes I don't recognize the impacts of what we totally have on justification. We have a community with diverse income in the city. But it's the solution to that is not necessarily abandoning numbers. That, I agree with that. Much the solution is to make sure that people, again, that's political, but the solution is to make sure that people that social science background, the understanding of how Austin came to be segregated city and how it and the impacts of the development laws that we've put in place over the last 30 years, as positive as we think they have been, have also contributed to forcing lower income people further and further away from the central city. I think that's the problem we're referring to. Then I'm just talking about a circle and I'm near a solution. But except to make sure that the sort of I think that's possible. That is possible.
Well, when we start talking in circles, that would remind us of the house of the audience. So, Billy?
Yeah, it's been a little more, but I'm just curious, how might we consider, well, when I think about codes and standards and policies, I'm a receiver of this as an architect. How might we consider the standard of care definition of architect constantly shifting as pushing back against always being in that position of receiver? In other words, when practice decides to take on something that's not within the standard of care, but comes more from defining your ethics differently, or ethical practice differently, then they then have just changed their definition of standard of care. We're set into motion a whole other series of unspoken protocols or self-imposed codes. I say that knowing it sounds like a virgin bottom-up activist
think I understood what
Excuse me, can I give you my-
you're saying. I don't think my voice. Is that on? So what I got out of the thought, is that you see that social change is happening so quickly, which generates technological change, that we can't rely on old and trusted definitions anymore about what a 2x4 piece of spruce is, right? Because we now have plantations very quickly grown material that don't measure up to even the technical standards that existed 10 years ago. It's not the same material. Right? So you're saying that materials, we have to constantly question what the actual materials are and to see if they measure up then to what our intentions are. And so our intentions as architects to have a certain standard of care, which is an ethical art. And so how do you do that? It means that we end up having to have a regime of constant information flows, right, to begin to somehow through post-occupancy evaluation provides an empirical basis for making decisions. I think that's what your firm is really trying to do, which is, I think, really adequate.
Right, I guess what I bring for our panelists is if that shifting definition of our standard of care that has any way of providing another kind of tension against the policies that we have a tendency to accept and receive. So we put ourselves in a position of receiving codes, receiving standards. There are, of course, committees that work on those codes and standards. We can point them out. But at the same time, is there another way of thinking about how we ourselves in our professions themselves, the sort of definition of professions and professional standards of care, how they also increase their how they change their definitions, and I mean from an ethical point of view, how those definitions for professions change over time to meet or to catch up or to actually exceed what policymakers are doing. That's really all I'm thinking about. Just thinking about it.
I'm thinking about what is the goal we have. We have here in Texas, and we have all over the world. The goal is to reduce the emissions of our energy consumption, to reduce CO2 emissions, because we know that our world will be damaged with these emissions. And the question is, how can we reach this? And we can reach it with rules. We can, if our government does nothing happens. I think so. I don't think that people are moving by themselves. Maybe, but it's a really a long process, which is it's becoming to move, but it's not fast enough, and so I think the governments have to do something. They have to take tax. They have to increase maybe the amount people have to pay for energy, and so people think, how can we save? How can we reduce our consumption? And our industry thinks about what new products can we develop that the energy consumption will be reduced in the future. And we can do it by tax, we can do it by rules, and I think we have found in our country a real, not a bad system. on the one side there are taxes, our energy costs much more than yours, and on the other side there are rules which are, in my opinion, not too high. These rules does not afford that everybody makes a passive house or a zero energy house. These are, for me, I told it, are these racing cars. And we can learn a lot of these buildings. Industry can learn a lot of these buildings, and they can learn it to produce maybe new, better materials and systems and things like this. But I think we have to start a movement, and we can do it. Of course, we can do it in the way that every day people are hearing that our world will be damaged if they don't change their way of life. You know, this is one thing we can do. The other thing is we can force it by increasing the costs they have to pay for energy consumption. And so I think we in Europe, I think, and in Germany, for me, this is the right way we do, and people do accept this. And we see in our cities, we see one thing. Politicians say we have now a time. Politicians they see that increasing the rules or mehr zu fordern als to demand more than the government demands. Say this is the right way, and see that this can force their situation as a politician, you know. And so in a lot of cities and communities, they afford that all public buildings has to be built in a passive house standard or in a zero energy standard or in a plus energy standard, which is much more higher than possible than the rules our government has given. So this is this is a movement I see that our government could maybe increase a little bit the rules in the future, but I think nothing would be coming to a movement if there is not rules or money by tax.
Just one small comment. I think it's of course only partially true. If we look to many other technological and social changes which are taking place these days, governments have no impact on that at all. So if we see how information technology, I mean, governments are just running behind what is going on, and we have a rapid change, and this is a rapid change not only in technology, but we see that is a rapid change in social things. I mean, the way young people communicate today, for example, it seems to be, for example, a very simple thing which I find extremely annoying. You seem not to be able to make an appointment for the next day. Yeah? You're waiting until 20 minutes before if there might be some new note on Facebook which might change it. So that's a tremendous impact on how people live and interact with each other. But I think no government has thought about it and has forced it. So we have seen in the past enormous technological changes which were driven just by private initiatives, by people. And so it's not completely clear that government initiatives alone will be able to do that. I think I think we have another problem. I think with things like climate change, resource scarcity, are very, very abstract. Yes, they are very abstract. It's very, and I doubt that there are more than 5 people in the world who really understand it in all details. Yeah. As, I mean, we all talk about it. We all say, yeah, we have climate change, we have the evidence, but I guess that few of us would be able to bring down all the evidences. And so it's very abstract, it's very complicated, and maybe we have some science now, some more floods, things like that, which may be related to it, or although some people say, okay, it's not. It's still in the natural fluctuations. So but maybe at some point we might realize it. And then I could imagine, of course it's a little late maybe, but then of course some of these other movements which we see in technological change, which is more driven by entrepreneurs and other people, can come on top of it. And we should at least open this possibility as well, which is more grassroots, so I start with something, and that this might happen as well. So it's not, I mean, it's probably a little bit more optimistic view in the future, because, I mean, when we look back what governments did, I mean, most of the ideas government imposed on the energy system were not so successful. I mean, if we look to nuclear, it was not the idea of the utilities to put nuclear on. It was governments, where people fascinated by technology said, that is the future, we have to do it. And then in Germany, the utility said, we have coal, why should we do that? We know how to deal with it. But then it was steadily going to this direction, and it was probably not so, it was fast, and we could discuss it a lot. So we have to be very careful if governments, in the end, really be able to do it in the right direction.
I very much agree with the larger picture that you're painting. I would point out that the role of government is we fund a lot of research, we do a lot of research. The role of government is to take the technological advances that we have already been made by the private sector, by the legal practitioners, by the researchers, by the universities, and find the best of those, incorporate those into our national standards and our laws. The role of government should not be to determine their sciences. Science has to be the role of government simply is to accept that science, to filter science, to ensure that we're getting at least the majority of it. I think in that context, you have to look to regulation, but we also have to create the opportunities for architects and engineers and everybody in this room to tell government what those next steps are, because that's not something the government is good at.
I'm actually very happy to give Richard the last word. I thought that was a pretty good last word. But maybe just one reflection of what Professor Hausleuten had to say. He made the reference to a movement. And so we although architects are very reluctant to talk in such social terms, in such political terms, I think that you clearly recognize that that's what's necessary. And so it really is to politicize the practice of architecture. I think it's really necessary. Now, it's now beyond 6:30. The reception is waiting, and I'm sure nobody else wants to hear any more analysis. Yeah, I don't know about your climate change. And so I think Petra should get the last word.
Yeah, I'd just like to invite you to the closing reception in the courtyard. The weather is beautiful, we have live music, and let's continue the energy exchange.